Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, April 1st, 2020. Today, we're talking about the Federal Reserve once again. A lot of that lately. And two new changes at the Fed that are really bad news for liberty and the economy. First of all, total secrecy for the Federal Reserve through the end of the year. And then bank reserve requirements, which used to be at 10%, are now down to zero. Plus, I've got an interesting tidbit from the FDIC. First of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We have a bunch of live streaming video channels that we're on, like YouTube, Facebook, DLive, Twitch, and Periscope, plus archived video versions at Brighteon, BitChute, BitTube, and Library. And then, of course, we have the audio-only podcast editions. That's iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, Spotify, all of them. Basically, you can find all of our archives, all the show notes, all the platforms we're on, all our social media channels, ways to support us, like our email newsletter or our membership program, which starts out as little as $2 a month. Find all of that on the show homepage over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to Liberty, all spelled out. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to Liberty. I just want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I'm very grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. I do hope you are happy, safe, and as healthy as can be in these crazy, crazy times. So hi to Patricia Dance, Essential Freedom, MRGF78, Bob Brewer, Michael Bogus, Gary Sampson, Justin Morrison, Pat Smith, Tyler B., Shane Lackey, Too Tall 509, Gerard Hay, and George Washington. Good morning, citizens. Shane Hazel says, keep up the great work, guys. I appreciate that, Shane. Always good to see you. A lot of the great work that I'm going to be citing in this episode comes from my buddy Mike Meharry, who's been working with us for quite a long time and does a lot of the writing. He's the lead writer and does a weekly podcast for Peter Schiff at schiffgold.com. And I also see Pick Shoes over on YouTube as well. And then I'm going to check out some stuff from Bob Murphy, the Mises Institute. We're going to look right at the Federal Reserve. They've got a press release that came out. Sometimes it's good to go right to the horse's mouth on these things to find out exactly what's going on. So let's start this out, and I want to say hi to Dennis and Eric over on Facebook as well before I get into it. So let's start this out with this article that we published a couple of days ago from Mike Meharry. Stimulus bill lets Fed operate in complete secrecy. Again, all these links that I'm going to pull up, if you're watching the video, I pull up the links so you can kind of, if you can look close enough, you can kind of read along with it as I go through the articles. But I will include that in the show notes. So if you're not reading along or if you want to reference it and read more detail, that's again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to Liberty. So, of course, we know Congress passed that $2 trillion stimulus bill. I love how they call that a stimulus bill, as if printing more money stimulates the economy. The phrase in and of itself is propaganda. It's totally wrong. So we should probably start making it a policy to not call it that. It's going to take me a while to break that habit, I promise you. But let me talk about that with Mike and see what he has to say. But so Congress passed this $2 trillion spending and ripoff bill, and we know there are trillions and trillions more that have already been spent, that are already in the pipes, and more trillions on the way, adding to trillions and trillions and trillions of an unsustainable debt. And he goes on, he says, most people have focused on the $1,200 checks, of course, because as soon as people learn that they're going to get a handout, I mean, who doesn't want $1,200 in their hands, right? That seems realistic, especially because they take so much from us all along. But most people are focusing on that. And I think in many ways it might even just be a trick to distract people, because what else are they sneaking in there? I haven't looked at it, but I'm expecting a lot of really bad garbage. I know a number of people, a number of my friends have been posting on social some of the handouts that they've been giving to different organizations and businesses. And of course, that's going to happen. But what else? He says, Mike writes, the 883-page bill does a lot more than just the $1,200 check, the bailouts for industries, including empowering the central bankers at the Federal Reserve to hand out billions of dollars to their Wall Street buddies in complete secrecy. So it authorizes specifically the Fed to create $454 billion out of thin air and loan it out. And they have complete autonomy on who gets that money. So it basically says not more than the sum of this money shall be made available to make loans and loan guarantees and other investments programs, blah, 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 as determined by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Mike goes on. He says the money will allow the Federal Reserve to create what are known as special purpose vehicles. These are SPVs. And we learned about this whole process from an article from the very progressive left-leaning site counterpunch.org or counterpunch.com, talking about they're approaching it from a corporate bailout. We approach it from a constitutional and the sound money mentality, but the end result is the same. We're both actually pointing out that there's a serious problem with doing this. These SPVs, during the 2008 financial crisis, Mike writes, the Fed used them to buy toxic debt from Bear Stearns to facilitate its takeover by JP Morgan Chase and to prop up AIG. In other words, they are a vehicle for federally backed corporate bailouts. What a surprise. Now, the Federal Reserve already on March 17th created one SPV. We know this is going to be happening with a lot of money, $454 billion worth. Now, this is where it gets really juicy, and Mike puts it this way. A provision of the stimulus bill throws a big shroud over the activities of the central bank. The bill repeals the Sunshine Law as it relates to Federal Reserve Board of Governors meetings until the end of 2020 or when the president determines the crisis has passed, whichever comes first. So the Sunshine Law says they're supposed to actually make their meetings available, so that what they're talking about, what they're doing, so there can be at least the Fed is pretty secret already, but there's a little bit of light shined on them. And whatever little bit of sunshine, and remember, sunshine is the best disinfectant, right? So whatever little bit of sunshine is on the Fed is now gone, at least until the end of 2020. This is in section 4009 of the bill. Mike cites it in the article. If you want to read it in full, I'm not going to bore you with it, but basically it's called Temporary Government in the Sunshine Act Relief. So that just the title of itself in that section is pretty crazy. The chairman, because of these unusual and exigent circumstances, they don't have to actually do anything publicly. Practically speaking, Mike writes, the new law effectively empowers the Fed to hand out money to whomever it pleases, and nobody will ever be able to find out the who's, how's, and why's. I guess, he writes, we're just supposed to have faith that Jerome Powell will do the right thing. No one should trust anyone in government. No one should trust politicians. No one should trust their backers. No one should trust the bureaucrats. Anyone, no man, no person with power should ever be trusted. It's not trust but verify. That is actually a dangerous approach because your first response is to trust that they're doing the right thing and then verifying later. It should be never trust. Because especially in a situation like this, when there is secrecy, there is no opportunity to verify. So trust but verify is actually very dangerous. And I know a lot of people on the conservative end of the spectrum, because that came from a very favorite president at some point, they love that approach. But it is very, very wrong, especially when it comes to the Federal Reserve. Mike sums this section up like this. He says, this looks like a recipe for cronyism and corruption on a massive scale. Now, we already have cronyism, we already have corruption on a massive scale, but this is going to make it even worse. He says, even if you accept the veracity of central bank bailouts of Wall Street, like, let's say you're like, okay, someone's got to do something, the Fed's going to come and do this. So even if you do accept that, he says it's difficult to understand the benefit of doing so in secret. So, like, even if you agree with bailing out airlines and hotels and restaurants and all these big banks or whatever is going to happen again, because as this bubble continues to deflate, a lot of businesses are going to go down. And a lot of businesses are going down because they didn't save for a dangerous time. They literally just followed. Now, of course, the Federal Reserve, through manipulating interest rates, making them artificially low, they encourage everyone to leverage up. And so to compete in the market, you just have to continue taking on more and more debt in order to operate in the marketplace. But that's not smart business. It's not smart business to literally run up your debt to the point that it can't be paid off in a crisis or you can't weather a dangerous time. So Mike goes this, I think I'll just read one more thing because he really nailed it in this article. He says, whenever civil libertarians complain about government surveillance, the response from the lovers of the monster state, he says, is if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. So he asks this great question, what is the Fed hiding and what does it fear? So as Gerard says, trust nothing, question everything. I think that's really, really the right way to approach it, especially in situations like this, because as I covered it last week, talking about how fear is the foundation of governments, John Adams warned us back in 1776, back when he was a good guy, that government would always take times of fear to expand their own power. Now, he was wrong. Well, maybe he was right at the time because he thought the Americans of that time would never succumb to this kind of thing. Of course, if he was making a prediction for the ages, he was totally off. He totally failed on that one because people are very willing to turn to centralized power every time they're afraid of everything, afraid of being without health care, afraid of getting ill, afraid of people in foreign countries, afraid of losing their job, afraid of everything. They want the government to come in and protect you. But government protection really means government control. And we are in a very dangerous situation, in my view. Now, I talked about the Federal Reserve a little bit more, manipulating these interest rates and how they actually have been creating this problem all along. And I mentioned on Monday's show, too, talking about Thomas Jefferson's view of debt and spending and printing, and George Washington. They warned us, like, look, you really can't just go crazy with the spending and the debt because from time to time you're going to run into a very dangerous situation. They were mostly focusing on war. And if your country is in a place where they have so much debt, it won't be able to weather the storm when they really need it. So at a time when we were supposedly living under the greatest economy in the history of the world, it was really just a big, fat, ugly bubble, bigger than the 2008 bubble, maybe the biggest one in history. I know Peter Schiff on his podcast has been probably calling that for a while. So if you haven't checked out this episode, the Federal Reserve created a bubble and is making things worse from March 11th. I will link to that one in the show notes as well. So let's take a look at what's going on. This press release from the Federal Reserve came out on the 15th, so a few weeks ago now. And this was primarily the press release to talk about how they were lowering interest rates once again. Now, they had already did the emergency reduction of interest rates, and now they're doing another one. This may have been May 17th, somewhere around there. So mid-March, I'm sorry. And they were reducing it another 150 basis points. But near the end of it, and I saw this from Bob Murphy. If you guys don't follow Robert P. Murphy, Bob Murphy Econ on Twitter, Bob is a great guy who I've been lucky enough to hang out with a few times over the last few years. But Bob is a great Austrian economist, does a podcast, writes for Mises Institute, is amazing on Twitter, all this stuff. And he put it this way. Tucked at the end of the Fed's press release is this interesting feature, which I first saw Josh Hendrickson point out. Basically, what they're doing is they are taking reserve requirements for banks and taking it from 10%, which is already problematic, and reducing it to zero. It says, in the light of the shift to an ample reserves regime, the board has reduced reserve requirement ratios to 0% effective on March 26th. So just a few days ago, banks' reserve requirement under the law. Now, if they're smart business, they don't want to extend themselves, but most of these banks are way overextended. The banks that had to be bailed out are in much worse shape now than they were back in 2007, 2008, and 2009. Most of those banks are even worse off. So I don't think they're managed well, and really the right response in an economic recession or a depression or a correction, part of the correction is to clear out businesses that have been managed poorly, have them go bankrupt. It's not like there won't be any banks or airlines or hotels anymore. Other people are going to come in and buy it at dirt cheap prices and have an opportunity to operate them in a better manner. So they're reducing it March 26th, the beginning of the next reserve maintenance period. This action eliminates reserve requirements for thousands of depository institutions and will help to support lending to households and businesses. Of course, the Federal Reserve just wants more lending, more money creation, more lending, more debt, more debt, more debt. They don't want savings. They don't want sound money. They just want printing, more money, more debt, and it's a real problem. So the way that Hendrickson put it, he actually said, as of March 26th, and I don't have his tweet handy here, but I'll see if I can pull it up when I publish the show notes for this. But he basically says, starting March 26th, all bank reserves are considered excess, so bad by the banking system. Now, here's an article, and I'm not going to go through this fractional reserve system, so basically keeping a part of the amount on deposit in reserve. Murray Rothbard would have said, or Mises would have said the case would have been for sound money to have 100% reserve. So if you put $1 in the bank, they keep $1. If you put $100 in there, they keep $1. But at 10% for every dollar, they're only keeping 10 cents, and they're loaning out another 90 cents. Here's how Bob put it. This is a great article, Fractional Reserve Banking Question, over at the Mises Institute from June 2010. So a 10-year-old article, but it's pretty timeless. And I'm just going to read through this because I think it's important to understand how it plays out. It's a very simple example, and that's even how Bob puts it in the article. He says, suppose a teenager, Bill, is rummaging in the attic and finds $1,000 in physical currency in an old chest. Bill is ecstatic and runs to the local bank, where he opens a checking account and deposits the green pieces of paper. I like how he puts that. Under a 100% reserve banking system, this would be the end of the story. In the act of making the deposit, Bill's currency holdings would fall by $1,000. So he wouldn't have the currency in his hand. His currency, if you had like line items, his currency would be zero in holdings in his hands. But his checkbook balance would rise by $1,000. Putting the money in the bank wouldn't affect the total amount of money in the economy. 1,000 here goes to 1,000 there. 0 here is now 1,000 there. It's just pretty simple math, right? However, Bob writes, in our current system, Bill's bank would see a new profit opportunity. After the bank put the $1,000 of paper currency into its vault, its reserve would be that much higher, while its outstanding deposit liabilities would have risen by $1,000 as well. But since banks in the U.S. are subject only to a reserve requirement of approximately 10%, now it wasn't exactly 10, so that's a good correction, the bank would have new excess reserves of $900. If it found a suitable borrower, the bank would have the legal ability to grant a new loan for this amount. So it's basically, in essence, it's creating another $900 through debt. So it's putting more money into circulation. Now, this is a voluntary action, but it certainly is manipulative. And Bob goes through all these charts and details, even on this very simple one, and then he goes through a very much more complex version. I do encourage you to read this. If you want to geek out, it's really good stuff. But in conclusion, he puts it this way. He says, in this present article, we have walked through a simple example to illustrate the strange nature of fractional reserve banking. In a very real sense, this process creates money out of thin air. Now, this observation alone, Bob writes, doesn't prove its illegitimacy, let alone its connection with the business cycle, but it should give pause to those who see nothing wrong with the practice. So now if banks don't have to have any money in reserve and they can just continue creating more money, in essence, loaning it out to more people, that puts more people on debt, more people using credit, things like that. People buy stuff. This is a manipulation of the economic system once again. Now, one other thing, as I was doing some research, I came across this really interesting post over at ccn.com. FDIC's ridiculous ad to stop bank runs is sending the opposite signal. And this came out just late last week, March 25th. The Federal Reserve Insurance Corporation, Deposit Corporation, I'm not sure how, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, it's FDIC, released a 1-minute video encouraging people to keep their money in the banks. They're concerned. The fact that they actually did this video, I'm not going to play it here. I'm not sure how YouTube is going to see that or whatever platform is going to see that. So I'm not going to play it, but you can go. I will link to that in the show notes, and you can watch this. 56 seconds. Now, in the video, Chairman Jelena McWilliams emphasizes that hoarding cash in mattresses didn't pan out well for so many people. The video is intended to discourage a bank run. So people during a crisis, I mean, I know I thought this immediately, like, oh, just in case there's electric problems, in case they say, like, essential services are only going to the hospital, you should have some cash on hand. You just never know how it's going to play out. That just seems like being smart. Having self-defense, some money, real money, some fiat currency, food, water, things like that. This is just being smart. This isn't being a hoarder. They use the negative phrase of hoarding. They use the same type of phrasing when it came to masks as well recently as well. That you're hoarding if you're just trying to be safe for yourself, your friends, your family. They go on further. They say, in this time when financial institutions are scrambling for liquidity, it's interesting that the FDIC released an ad that discourages people from withdrawing their money because they don't really want people to use they don't really even want you to use the cash, the fiat dollars. They just want you to take out loans. They just want you to get government handouts, which I guess are really not even just a handout. From what I'm reading, and maybe someone can correct me because I've only looked into this briefly, it looks like these $1,200 checks are really nothing more than a tax credit on a future year. So someone can maybe explain what that is to me in the comments, or feel free to email me some details if you've looked into this further. team@10thamendmentcenter.com. They go on a little further on this. The FDIC can only cover a fraction of the deposits. Now, we know that no one, and they say this over and over, no one has ever lost money in an FDIC-insured bank account. No one ever loses any of their insured money. If we can call it real insurance, I don't know. McWilliams stressed, they write, with conviction that no depositor has lost money of their insured deposits since the 1930s. That sounds encouraging, except that the FDIC has reserves to cover 2% default on deposits. So they've been kind of playing this kind of fractional reserve system in that as well. So the banks are only required to keep 10%. So then, of course, all banks do that in order to look good to the stockholders because they're always generating more money, more income, more loans, etc., and they're not being sound. And then the FDIC comes out and says, don't start pulling out cash. Don't worry. No one is ever going to lose the money. No one ever has. But if you look under the hood, we know that they only have a 2% reserve. And it's actually called the Deposit Insurance Fund Management. So this is the deposit insurance, the DIF balance. And you can see every single year, it's at least over the last decade, it has been at 2%. They give you the numbers, 2%, 2%, 2%. And if it actually gets below 1.35%, which it did just around the last crisis, economic crisis, 2007 through 2010, it went down to 1.25 because people, of course, during an economic downturn are going to take out some cash to have some liquidity on hand. So if the reserve ratio falls below 1.35, or the FDIC projects that the reserve ratio will within 6 months, they generally must adopt a restoration plan that provides that the DIF will return to 1.35 within 8 years. So they've only got 2%. You take that however you want to take that. I don't feel a lot of security in that at all. And it's interesting because I think one of the best ways of summing up the problems of going down to a 0% reserve requirement comes from a comment on Reddit, a thread that I was reading on Reddit from someone who actually supports the action. So they're actually saying there's nothing to worry about here. Don't worry about it. It's no big deal. But he says it does signal, this is from someone with the name, who knows, a little bunny rabbit. Wow, screen names online are great. This does signal something somewhat more concerning. Reserve requirements are generally the last tool that the Fed has to manipulate the money supply and, by extension, the economy, especially now that they're getting down towards zero on the federal funds rate. If they go into negative, that creates its own problems. They don't have a lot of room to go. And in that episode that I did on March 11th, the Federal Reserve created the bubble and is making things worse, I pointed out that in 2007, the federal interest rate was somewhere in the 5% range, and then they went all the way down to zero. Now, this time around, it started around 1.5%, 1.75%, so they don't have as much room to manipulate the economy through interest rates. And so they can't really re-inflate the bubble as much as they did in the past, and that does not bode well for how things will play out over the next 5 to 10 years. So historically, this commenter writes, they avoid manipulating reserve thresholds at all costs. Now that they've gone all the way to zero, there really isn't much else the Fed can do to stimulate the economy. And the quick reminder, and I covered this on Monday, Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to his good friend John Taylor in 1816, I think this is the best way to close it out. He said, "I sincerely believe with you that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale." Some wisdom from Thomas Jefferson to close it out. I think that really, really sums it up well. Let me take a look over in the live chat and see what's going on here. If there's some interesting questions I can answer. Bill Brenner says, dump the Fed. Absolutely. Alan Hughes, banks are shysters. Yeah, I mean, they're all part of this banking system that runs on this fiat funny money that really pushes debt, that manipulates the economy. They are not good guys. They aren't like your local loan guy down the street or whatever that would have been. It's not like It's a Wonderful Life. You can go and have a chat with your banker. That is not really how the whole system works anymore. And even back then, they made the banker the bad guy too. Gerard says reboots are organic. Dennis Marburger asks, good to see you, Dennis. What are your thoughts regarding the alleged Fed Treasury combination with Trump taking control of the Fed? Is this true? If it were, I don't know anything about it, but if you post a link, I'll take a look at it, Dennis. Post a link in the comments, and I will check that out a little bit later today. Essential Freedom, absolutely right, buddy. This is a pyramid scheme. It's a Ponzi, Social Security, for example. And Gerard says it's an un-American banking system. But Jefferson talked about this un-American banking system for many years, all the way back in 1791 when he was arguing against the constitutionality of the first bank or the Bank of the United States. He said under the Constitution, there is no power delegated to the federal government to create its own bank. Crossan, who do you see yourself voting for in 2020? Probably nobody. I only support the Constitution, and I think for me personally, giving a vote to someone is giving their approval, so I don't know. That's the last thing on my mind right now. Crossing thoughts on Joe Biden. He's a warmongering pig. He's evil. So no, he's terrible. I actually made a prediction early last year on Twitter. I said my thought at the time was that either we are going to be facing a new full-scale war. I thought we were going to see either a new full invasion of another country or we were going to get Joe Biden as president. And a lot of people laughed it off, saying no one's going to vote for that guy. He doesn't even have a chance. He won't even get out of the primary. But in general, I think a lot of people will vote for a trash bag, a pile of poop, something. They don't care. They're like, most people are not thinking. A lot of people vote based on who everybody else is voting on, and that is a serious problem as well. Just scrolling a little bit further here, Gerard also says, trust nothing, question everything. I appreciate all your feedback on this and some of our other episodes where I've seen you here as well. And Essential Freedom says this is elite pocket stimulus. That's a good way of putting it. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you learned something. This is not good news. Sometimes I like to do episodes where it's good news, where we're pushing back, we're undermining federal power, but unfortunately we're getting just a free fall of negative stuff lately. But this is kind of behind the scenes. I think it's important to share the information, so I do hope you learned something. I hope you're staying safe, you're stocked up, you're healthy as can be in these times, and we're going to continue working to build a foundation for liberty no matter what they throw at us. As they say, duty is ours, right? So thank you so much for joining me. Make sure to smash that like button, hit subscribe, continue leaving comments. Reviews on iTunes do help us out a lot. And of course, if you want to support us financially, as little as $2 a month goes a long, long way. You can join us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Thank you so much for joining me again today. I'll see you on Friday here on the path to liberty.